I'm happy to be here again tonight. Welcome to Landscapes Far and Wide. This is the third webinar in our four-part series, and tonight's webinar is entitled Telephoto Landscapes and Telling a Story. So welcome back if you were here for the first couple webinars, and welcome if this one is your first. So tonight, more specifically, we'll talk about the thought process of telling a story within the frame and why and when you might choose a telephoto lens. After that, we're going to talk about finding multiple stories in a single landscape and using multiple lenses or focal lengths to create a variety of unique images. I'm really excited about tonight's topic, and I have a lot of stuff to get through. So hopefully I won't go over too much and leave enough time for questions. In case we have anyone new here tonight, I just quickly will share a little bit about myself again. I'm a landscape and nature photographer from the suburbs of Chicago. I've lived in the Midwest outside Chicago for the last 27 years, but I love to travel and to explore other landscapes of the world. My annual trips to my grandparents' home in the Tetons since I was a tiny girl really nurtured my love of nature and especially of the mountains. For many, many years, I wanted to learn about photography, but it wasn't actually until my twins were born in 2011 that I really dove in and took the plunge to learn how to control the camera. It was during a solo trip to the Tetons. I escaped my kids and went and spent the weekend in September of 2012, just me and my camera. And that's when I just truly fell in love with landscape photography. After that, there was no turning back. And I've been teaching an online landscape photography class since 2014. And I launched my first ladies landscape photography retreat in the Tetons 4 years ago. Since then, I've added other locations, Chicago, Banff, and Glacier. And I just really love to help others to capture their vision. And I love to connect with others who love both photography and nature as much as I do. So in our first webinar, Set for Success, we talked about gear that is crucial or helpful for capturing compelling landscape images. We also discussed how developing a strong understanding of technical skills will help us achieve a smooth workflow and free up our mind for creativity. Last week, we got a little more technical, talking about wide-angle landscape photography. We discussed how to capture images in challenging high dynamic range scenes and techniques for capturing depth and sharpness throughout the frame. We also went through a step-by-step with long exposure photography and talked about ways to refine and review these images. I really love wide-angle landscape photography in the grand landscape, but over the last few years, I've really also come to fall in love with telephoto and intimate landscapes. So the lenses that I've used in this presentation are similar as to the previous webinars, the Sigma 14mm 1.8, and you'll notice that's not in the telephoto images that we start with, but there's a couple in the later part when we talk about telling a story with multiple focal lengths. The Sigma 24 to 105, especially at the 105, I use that as well for longer focal length images. And then the Sigma 150 to 600, 5 to 6.3 contemporary lens, which I absolutely love for capturing intimate landscapes. This first image I am sharing here is from June in the Tetons on a really stormy day. The clouds and rain just kept passing over the mountains, and it was completely mesmerizing. So I used the 150 to 600 to capture Mount Moran with those dramatic clouds and atmosphere surrounding it. And I love the way it really brings Mount Moran close to us. Before we dive in a little bit more, I wanted to revisit the mindset and approach of our first webinar, Set for Success. In this webinar, I shared the belief that our creative mindset is just as critical to creating compelling images as our gear and technical skills. I encourage you to slow down and connect with the environment before setting up and clicking the shutter. As I do this, there is always one question I ask myself as I prepare to photograph. And that question is, what is drawing my eye to the scene? I wanted to consider, what do I find interesting? What is making me curious? If someone was standing next to me, what would I point at and say, hey, look at that. That's really awesome. Such amazing light, or look at that color. So that's always what I'm thinking about before I set up, before I click the shutter and capture the scene in front of me. In this particular image that I have here on the screen right now, I was standing on the shores of the Snake River, looking across the water at Mount Moran during sunrise. And as the light began to move across the shore, this single golden tree was illuminated by the sunshine, and I couldn't take my eyes off of it. It was quite a ways away from me, so I used the 150 to 600 to zoom in and isolate the tree amongst the low clouds floating behind it. Though the entire scene was beautiful, and I certainly captured that as well, the story of this single tree was best told with a longer focal length where it wouldn't get lost among the other elements. So as you explore the landscape or sit quietly observing and taking it in, I would encourage you to ask yourself, what is drawing your eye to the scene? Is it the expanse? Is it a colorful or dramatic sky? Or is it a pocket of light hitting the mountaintop or a particular group of trees? Or maybe it's a pattern of repetitive shapes, lines, or textures within the scene. In this image up on the screen right now, I chose to use the 150 to 600 at 150 millimeters in a vertical orientation so I could emphasize the height and grandeur of the Grand Teton. Using the longer focal length allowed me to bring the mountain closer and make it more impressive in the frame. The wider focal length of this lens at 150 allowed me to capture the trees below, which not only grounds the scene, but also tells the story of the autumn colors. So now you've determined what's drawing your eye, what's next? So I'm always thinking, is my subject close or far away? And then I'm also wondering, what do I want to include? And just as importantly, what do I want to exclude? I want to include the supporting elements that add to the story and create depth, but I also want to exclude distractions, anything that might draw the eye away from the main focal point of the image and my story, or that might lead the eye out of the frame in an unwanted way. Last week, we talked about wide angle landscapes and scenes where a wide angle captures the essence of the story. For this week, I definitely wanted to start the beginning of this presentation talking about when a telephoto lens is a great choice. So why telephoto? In many cases, it can help you zoom in on far off scenes you can't get to with your feet. And in landscape photography, there are a lot of situations like this, when something on the other side of a lake grabs your eye, or the tip tops of the mountains. We can't always get where we want to go with our feet. So the telephoto is really helpful in allowing us to get closer and capture those details better. A telephoto isolates details in an otherwise busy scene and can eliminate boring or distracting elements. A telephoto can focus on shapes, textures, and pockets of light. You can really fill the frame with the essence of your story. It's also a great choice for those less than ideal weather conditions. Think of really overcast, dreary skies, or at times those clear, endless, cloudless blue sky days. Another thing the telephoto is great for is capturing wildlife as an element within the landscape, not just the close-ups of the wildlife. So the two zoom lenses that I've used in the images that I'm going to share today are the Sigma 150 to 600 and also the 24 to 105, largely at the closer focal length of 105 millimeters. The combination of these two lenses is really fantastic because it really gives you a great span of focal lengths all the way from the wide angle to 600. And there's just a very little window from 105 to 150 that you're missing, and I can always work around that. So I love the combination of these two lenses. So first I wanted to share a few tips for shooting with the 150 to 600 f5 to 6.3 contemporary lens, as it is heavy and quite large. So this makes it a challenge, of course, to haul it and hike with it and travel with it, but I always find that it's worth it. It does also make it challenging to stabilize and make sure you get sharp images. When possible, a tripod is going to help stabilize the lens, so you can use a lower shutter speed and therefore a lower ISO. I definitely recommend using the tripod when you have a chance. And although it's ideal, I will say that I often shoot handheld with this lens. This is sometimes because, you know, moving around without the tripod really helps to get find that perspective that's speaking to me and to nail that composition. Sometimes it's really because a certain moment has grabbed me, and it's one of those like quick moments and you don't want to miss it. And sometimes it can be setting up that tripod. You could end up missing that little bit of light that is just coming, or you can just end up missing the moment. And in those situations, I would much rather just grab the camera and shoot it handheld, raise my shutter speed and ISO to make sure that I got the shot. However, I do recommend using the tripod when you have the ability to do so, because it will help you to keep the ISO lower. Handheld, I find that I need a minimum shutter speed of 1/1250 to avoid camera shake. Sometimes I get lucky with a little bit less. This came over a period of time of experimentation, finding what my own sweet spot is. It may or may not be yours. I could be more shaky, maybe you're a little more steady, or vice versa. So I would encourage you to do that and just see what works for you. And then, as you can see, and I've said before, I do raise my ISO to achieve proper exposure rather than underexposing. So if I need to keep my shutter speed high and I am grabbing that quick handheld shot, I will raise my ISO to get proper exposure. Underexposing also increases the noise when you raise the shadows in post-processing. So I prefer to raise the ISO and get proper exposure. With wide angle photography last week, we talked about with depth of field to get your frame acceptably sharp throughout. We talked about focusing, using the guideline of focusing about 1/3 into the frame. With the telephoto lens, I recommend focusing on your main subject of your story and or the closest element in the frame. So you may not, with the compression of the longer lenses, you may not have everything completely sharp in the frame. And if you focus on something behind what you really want to be sharp, you're going to find that that main subject is not sharp. So focus on what's the main subject, or focus on what is the closest in frame, because then things in back will be more in focus than what's in the front. So that's a tip for the telephoto. And there's a couple examples here where I can show a little bit what I'm talking about in that regards. A few tips for finding impact using telephoto images. I love to use my telephoto lenses to capture atmosphere and mystery, the dramatic weather like fog and low clouds. Those are some of my favorites for isolating that kind of atmosphere in telephoto lenses, landscapes. Another thing that I love to do is to fill the frame with the essence and story of the image. So that will exclude anything that detracts or distracts from the story. Look for depth through layers or light and shadow. And then also look for repetitive lines, patterns, and shapes. And that kind of stuff you can really fill the frame and keep out extra areas of the landscape that are detracting from those particular areas. So here are some examples when I've used my telephoto focal lengths, and I'll share why I use those and a little bit about the story behind these images. In this first one, this is on the shore of Maui in spring break, and I was out shooting the sunset. The wide angle here was really beautiful, as you can tell. It was a very colorful sky. And I started off kind of capturing some of the waves as they came into the shore, shooting some long exposures, And as I was watching the sun gradually going down into behind these clouds, it was that sun going right behind the clouds that really grabbed my attention and seemed to me to be the most beautiful part of the evening. And then I noticed this sailboat off in the distance, and it was slowly approaching the sun. And so this is one of those moments where I noticed this moment happening, and I wanted to quickly grab it. So I grabbed my longer lens, the 150 to 600 on my Z6, and at 300 millimeters, I zoomed in so that I could really get closer to the boat and the sun, keeping some of the water and the glow in the water to add to the atmosphere here. So this is one of those, okay, I need to grab this quick. If I took my other camera off to set it up on the tripod, I might have missed this moment. This is one of my favorite images from September of 2018 when I was out in the Tetons. I was shooting a sunset in this particular location where there's some really beautiful fall foliage. The sun was coming through the sagebrush that was in front of these trees actually, and I was shooting some wider angle shots as the sun hit the mountains and capturing a couple sunbursts and just capturing the wider scene. And then as the sun went behind the mountains, this light that hit the mountains didn't happen right away. And I was kind of thinking about kind of moving on, going to another location as it got dark. But I kept watching the light. And suddenly I noticed that as the sun kind of came from behind these peaks and just lit up in this triangle on the ground. And I found it really mesmerizing. So I quickly opened my bag and grabbed the 150 to 600. And I wanted to really capture that light. So I loved the fall foliage that was in the foreground to help tell the story of the fall colors, to add some depth and the way that it complements the golden light that was hitting the mountains. I didn't want any more sky. There was not a single cloud in the sky that night. So I didn't want extra sky. I just wanted to isolate that beautiful light and the fall colors. So this was shot at 150 millimeters. And I had to open up to f5 here. I was losing light because the sun was going behind the mountains there. Trees are a subject that I love to capture with a longer focal length to get closer in to the details that are drawing my eye. This was in the Smoky Mountain National Park last fall. Pulled off at one of the overlooks. There was some light streaming down the hillside, just beautiful fall color. And as I looked around, I noticed this single branch, and I love the way it curved and the various colors surrounding it, the yellow and the orange and red. This tree was actually hanging over the road. So lots of cars were going by, and that the whole entire scene in this direction wasn't necessarily that interesting, but I loved this one single branch, and it just seemed to have this personality for me. So this is another situation where I wanted to zoom in and capture only the details that were really speaking to me and excluding the surroundings that weren't part of the story for me. This is at 210 millimeters. Here's one with the 24 to 105, captured at 105 millimeters. This is on the road to Hana. We were driving the road to Hana on a rainy day. No surprise, since it gets lots of rain. And as we drove, there was so much fog and atmosphere. It was really quite amazing. I saw so many frames that I would have loved to capture had we been able to pull over. And we stopped at a restroom part way, and it was raining. And as I was getting out of the car, I noticed all this fog and these beautiful trees, and came back to the car. And quickly before we headed off, I was like, I need to capture this. So I grabbed my camera, and I just loved the way the fog was kind of framed in between the taller trees. And I loved that tree on the left. There were some power lines actually in this area. So they were a bit of a distraction as well. So that made zooming in and taking those out of the frame, zooming right in on that area of atmosphere was perfect to tell the story of what was making me so mesmerized by this particular scene. And this was pretty low light as well. You can tell my settings here with a slightly higher ISO and f5. I could have lowered my shutter speed here, so that would have been something that might have been better to do. This is one of my absolute favorite images from my March trip to the Tetons this past year. This was a magical morning shooting sunrise at Oxbow Bend. After the sunrise, just kind of walking around in the parking lot, looking at the trees, and I noticed most of the Snake River was iced over with snow, but I noticed this far off part in the distance where there was some mist that was coming off. I guess there was an open patch of water and into these really frosty trees. This was really quite far from me, and it was a pretty small area as well. So there is no way I would have been able to capture this except with a long telephoto lens. So this one's captured at 560 millimeters, and I zoomed in pretty far off, just trying to get the one little area that was grabbing my eye. I love winter scenes like this. Another tree image with the 150 to 600. This was captured the summer of 2020. I was out shooting a sunrise, and I was headed back to the cabin to meet up with my family for the day. And as I drove through the park, I noticed there was a butte full of trees, and the sun was just streaming through certain little pockets of the trees, not the entire butte, but just little pockets. And it was just stunning, these rays that were coming through the trees. And I couldn't pull over right away, but finally I found a spot that I could pull over pretty far away. So this is one of those where I really had to zoom in all the way to 600 so I could isolate just the little pockets of light that were calling to me. And this is one of those light and shadow. It also shapes. With this one, I don't just see trees, but I also see triangles and almost rectangles of diagonal light coming down from the left. So this is, that's one of my favorite images. And again, it's one of those kind of wandering, just pull off the road because something grabbed my eye, and just capturing it before that light went away. This is a similar situation to that one of having to pull over at the nearest pullout. As I was driving, headed to find something new to shoot, just go to a new location, the clouds and light just started to separate a little bit, and the sun started hitting the peaks of the Tetons, just really bringing out the depth and the texture of the granite, a mix of moody clouds and a little bit of light. So I pulled out at the closest pullout I could find. And of course, the wide view of the Tetons is always beautiful, but in this particular location, it was really the tips of the peaks and the clouds that were dancing across the mountains that were grabbing my eye, that made me pull over. So this one was at 230 millimeters, and just had to capture that light as it was hitting the mountains. So again, this is one of those situations where it wasn't the wider view that was calling to me. It was really the way the clouds and the peaks were coming together. In a wider scene, you would see that, but you wouldn't see the detail and the mix of the clouds and the mountains right there together.
More Jax.
So here is some more trees. And this one is in the Smoky Mountains at Clingman's Dome. Driving up there was tons of fog and low clouds, and apparently that's pretty typical for Clingman's Dome and for Smoky Mountains. And there were various pockets that we could see the land below, the beautiful view. And as I looked up at the hillside, I was really drawn by these low clouds floating through this area of the mix of evergreens and these empty tree trunks. So the repetitiveness of these lines and textures, the more rough textures of the trees, both the evergreens and these, empty tree trunks with the branches, mixed with the soft fog, really was quite entrancing. Taking a wider angle here would have really lost the story. It would have had a lot of empty white sky. So using the longer lens at 600 millimeters allowed me to fill the frame with the textures and lines and atmosphere that was drawing me to the scene. This one is another one of those quickly pull over and grab the light while it's there. After a full 24 hours of not seeing the mountains through rain and overcast skies, suddenly the clouds began to part and the sun started to peek through. I was driving to one location and saw that Mount Moran was getting this light hitting the tip, and I quickly pulled over and pulled out my camera that was sitting on my front seat so I could capture the way the mountain was peeking through the clouds and the way the light and shadow was bringing out the texture here. Here's an example of how a telephoto can help you to capture animals or wildlife within the landscape. And this is also one of those situations where you can see that the grass in the foreground of my image is soft. This one I focused on the horse, as that was my primary subject that I wanted to be sharp. And that left some of this grass in the foreground soft at 300 millimeters. If I had focused really close in the foreground, then my background would not have been sharp. So in this one, I focused on the horse, and the rest of the background is acceptably sharp. It's just the grass in the foreground. And for me, that's an unimportant part of the frame. For me, it leads my eye to the horse. So it was a very intentional choice. And that's an example of how if you focus in too far in the foreground, or I should say, if you focus further back, things in the foreground are going to be a little bit more soft. So you just have to decide what's important for you to make sure is sharp in your image. But I love the way this image captures the horse in the landscape. It's definitely a main subject, but we also get the sense of the surroundings. And I was really far off from him, so you can tell that with 300 millimeters, so it's pretty distant. Another thing I love to do with longer focal lengths is to capture long exposures and to do intentional camera movement with water and trees. So we talked about the steps for long exposures last week in our wide angle presentation, but I also like to use longer focal lengths at times to capture long exposures of water or like the ocean or waterfalls. So there's a couple of examples here. This top one on the right is a more classic long exposure. I zoomed in closer to the waves here. I wanted to really focus on the movement and texture of the water. And it also brought the distant island and this pretty sky a little bit closer in the frame. This one was captured at 0.8 seconds, and I was using a 6-stop neutral density filter in order to slow the shutter speed to the 0.8 seconds. The one below is using intentional camera movement, and I love to do this with water, and I love to do it with longer focal lengths because it really brings us in closer and adds a little bit of compression at times. So this one is also 0.8 seconds, and I was also using a 6-stop neutral density filter. In this particular image, I was really drawn to the shape of the waves. And when you do intentional camera movement, you want to use a slower shutter speed, and either right after you press the shutter, if you have time, or as you press the shutter, you want to stabilize the camera and move the camera slightly in the direction that you want it to go. So in this image with the water, after I pressed the shutter, I moved the camera slightly from left to right. The slower you go, you get a little bit more shape and texture in the scene that you're capturing. The faster, you get a little bit more abstract feel. So in this particular image, I moved fairly slow so that I would keep some of the shape of that wave. And here's one more of the similar intentional camera movement, again with 105. It just adds a soft and painterly look. I moved the camera fairly slow on this one as well. As you can see, some of the texture in the water and a hint of the shape of the wave as well. When I do this technique with both water and trees, I have a tree image to share with you next. It's pretty normal to get images that you really don't care for, that don't turn out as you hope. But sometimes you'll look at your screen and just think you'll just kind of sigh and it takes your breath away. So it's kind of a fun technique to try, especially when you have shapes or colors that are calling to you, or even in less than ideal conditions. Here's another example of the intentional camera movement using trees. And in this particular case, the camera movement is vertical. So as I press the shutter, I move the camera up and get movement by moving the camera up or down versus the horizontal movement with the water. In this particular image, I used a 165 millimeter focal length for a couple of reasons. The first reason is I captured this at a home in Michigan when we were away skiing, and there was a pocket of trees just beyond the home. As the sunrise light was streaming into the house, I noticed that it was golden and beautiful, and so I just stepped out, took a glance at the trees, and noticed the golden sunrise coming through the tree trunks. There was a huge, huge mound of snow at the end of the driveway that there is just no way I would have been able to get over to get closer to these trees. So the telephoto lens allowed me to get my frame closer to the trees. And the other reason is that I love the compression that the longer focal length gives with the trees. I chose 165 millimeters as my frame here. As you can see, there's a tree on the left that's closer to us and also one on the right. I wanted to keep both of those in the frame to add a sense of balance and depth in the image. If you go out to try intentional camera movement, I definitely encourage you to try using a tripod and also to try doing it handheld. Using a tripod will help to keep you steadier, so more steady with the horizon or steady straight up with, say, the lines of trees. But I also find sometimes it's easier for me to do handheld and I end up happy with the results. So I would encourage you to try both ways, to try various shutter speeds, to try slower movement where you keep some shape and texture, and then also faster movement that gives you a little more abstract. This one was a little bit faster movement. And this one, I actually was not using a filter and my shutter speed is 1/8 seconds. When I'm not as slow as maybe a second, one thing that I try to do is I'll put my camera in continuous shooting and I'll just bring the camera up to my face. And as I start to move, I'll just press the shutter down, maybe 3 to 5 times as I move. And then it helps you to get the movement that you might not be able to get otherwise. So if you can't get your shutter speed all the way down to a second, that's something that you can try. Just move the camera a little bit faster and try to take several shots as you move the camera. It's really fun and a creative thing to do. And especially if you're not feeling super creative, I highly recommend giving it a try. That's one of my favorite things to do with longer focal lengths. So moving on, I wanted to share now how I go about thinking about a scene and capturing a variety of images in a single location. So in the next few frames, I'm going to share a few different spots and a handful of images or a couple images from each location using different focal lengths and why I chose those focal lengths and how they tell unique stories. So to start with, this one is at Glacier Point in Yosemite National Park. This was my second time to the park, but my first time to Glacier Point. And this view just completely took my breath away. I'm sure if you've been there, you know how truly amazing and vast this view is. Pictures can hardly do it justice. And in this particular image, I chose to do a panorama, and this is a 17 vertical frames across. Even the widest angle didn't seem to quite get all of this in the frame. I wanted to capture that tree on the left and the tree on the right to frame this incredible view. And using a slightly longer focal length of 42 millimeters brought those mountains a little bit closer to me. I shared this one largely because it really shows the vast view that I was standing in front of. And so that way you have an idea of what I was looking at when I capture the images in the next frame here. So these three images were also captured from that same spot and give a different feel. That first one gives you the whole width of the viewpoint. Well, these give just little slices of what I was looking at. I shared this first vertical image that's on the left during our first webinar. And this is just a small slice of that view of Nevada and Vernal Falls. This one was my story of looking down on the lower waterfall where my family had hiked to that day. So that was a special story. And this one was captured at 105 millimeters. The upper right image was captured with a fairly wide focal length at 32 millimeters, but you can see that it really doesn't even come close to capturing the width of what the panorama captured. And then on the bottom right, I used another longer focal length of 105 millimeters to really zoom in on Half Dome and make that the hero of my story. So just an example of how you can use different focal lengths and tell stories of one standing in one place and tell unique stories depending on which lens and what focal length you choose to use. Both of these images were captured at Hidden Falls and Grand Teton National Park. I shared the image on the top last week when we were talking about shooting long exposures. And this was my example of when you might want to shoot a faster shutter speed to capture the movement of foliage in a long exposure shot. So this one had two exposures, one for the exposure of the movement of the water, as well as another exposure to freeze the movement of the foliage surrounding the waterfall. The top image is the wider scene that I sat and enjoyed for a while. The bottom image is a more intimate shot of the same waterfall at the top. As I sat there, I was completely mesmerized by how much water flow there was. It was just really, really flowing. It was so strong and so loud and windy and wet. And I loved the way the water was kind of spraying a bit at the top. And I also noticed that tiny little tree that sat on the left side of the waterfall. So I used the longer focal length of 105 to zoom in and just capture that top of the waterfall that was really calling to me. This one, I also used two different shutter speeds. I think it was about 0.4 seconds for the water. And then you can see my little thing is hiding. It was 1/80, I believe, for to capture the foliage on either side so it wouldn't be moving. So I love to capture the wide scene, but then also to think about what are the stories here? What are the smaller stories within the grander scene? And I love the way that the longer focal lengths can do that. These two were both taken at String Lake. The first image on the top right, you've seen in previous webinar. I shared it along with my histogram, and as an example of how the wide angle can really capture that amazing sunrise and large objects in a frame. So the 14 millimeter was able to capture all these mountains, the sky, the reflection, this magical sunrise. This image on the bottom right was captured in the same morning, same place, but really focuses in on the trees and the rocks and the way they were just had this pristine reflection in the water. So two completely different images, two different stories standing in the same location. And this is actually the same location as those last two images, standing in a different spot along String Lake. These two were captured on a different morning, but they were captured on the same morning. And I was standing in the same spot on the lake when I captured each of these. So one of them on the right is Mount Moran reflecting in the water. We started off the sunrise without a cloud in the sky, and gradually these wispy clouds came along. And I love the way the morning light was lighting up the mountain. So this one is with a 42 millimeters. And at the same time as I noticed that mountain, that's when I noticed the sunlight that was starting to hit that single tree that had been calling to me all morning. And so that one is captured with the 150 millimeter. And I'm literally standing in exactly the same, my feet are in the same place, capturing these two different images, different views, different lenses, different stories. These two images were captured at Newfound Gap in Smoky Mountain National Park last October. And I think really show how your focal length and lens choice can really changed the story of an image. This top image on the right was 70 millimeters, which is not super wide, but for this image on the top, for me, the story becomes the whole environment, the whole view from this over the hillside, over the trees in the front, the winding road and fall foliage, and the distant mountains. This particular morning hadn't been all that fantastic as sunrise, but as those clouds started to part, those amazing rays started coming through. And the bottom image on the right, captured at 150 millimeters, for me, zooms in on those mountains, on the light rays that are coming through. And I feel like this is a much stronger story of how that light was peeking through, just standing there. I was with a friend and we're like, look at that light. And I feel like that bottom right image tells that story. The top image was, within a very short period of time from the bottom image, but doesn't tell the same story for me. The one on the bottom is the one that tells the story of what was really grabbing my eye. On the next slide, I used my 150 to 600 at 600 to capture just the S-curve of the road that we see in that top image up on the right. So here's just that S-curve as I zoomed in at 600 millimeters. I shot this on a tripod, but I still had a shutter speed of 1/400 as I wanted to freeze the motion of the car that was coming through. I got this set up and I waited until I had one single car going along the road. And so that's when I wanted to capture this image. So you can see that just with different focal lengths, standing in the same view, you can tell different stories. Maybe you get one shot that tells your story of the day, or maybe you can get several different shots that tell different stories within that grand view. Here's a winter landscape using several, two different focal lengths, but different stories within this single landscape. I was near the Grovant River that you can see in the upper right image. I was up a little bit on a hillside. That first upper right image is actually captured with 150 millimeters and is an example of how sometimes you need that telephoto lens to get closer to what's drawing your eye. I was up high, I couldn't, right below me, I would have gone over a cliff to get closer to this water. And I wanted to get that water in the bottom of my frame to get closer to those trees and capture the mountain and the sky above. So the 150 allowed me to capture what might even look like a wider angle landscape because I couldn't get there with my feet. Or a little bit earlier in the morning, prior to that one on the upper right, the sunlight was just lighting up mist coming through a pocket of the trees. So on the bottom left image, I used 400 millimeters to zoom in and capture only that mist and light as it went through the trees and lit up some of that frost below. So capturing those trees on the lower left with the really wide angle, it would have been pretty, but it wouldn't have told the story of that light and that atmosphere. And then lastly, on the right, I have just this tiny little like weed little thing coming out with hoarfrost, and it was just sparkling in the sun. So I used the compression of 400 millimeters to zoom in on those details and get some of that little bokeh in the background. So three different shots to tell the story of this single landscape. I have just a couple more scenes to share with you to wrap up today. This is overlooking a beautiful view of the Tetons just outside the park. The top image with the 14 millimeter upper right shows you where I was standing and really the wide view of this incredible view of the mountains. You can see with the 14 millimeters that the mountains really feel very far away and they don't feel terribly impressive with this really wide angle. But this does show you the whole scene, and I was able to capture the beautiful sunburst in the upper left with a longer focal length I wouldn't have captured. For me, this probably wasn't the strongest story that was speaking to me, but it's an example of that wider view. And I think it's a great example to show you what I was working with as I captured a couple of these other images. The image on the lower right was with 62 millimeters. And this I really, really love because it captures foreground, it captures the valley below, the road leading towards the mountains. The mountains feel much more impressive to me, more like they looked in real life, and the beautiful sky above. At the same time as I love that wider view of the 62 millimeters that include all of the elements that I loved as I stood there for quite a while that evening, I really love the way the clouds were floating past the Grand Teton, which is what I captured on the left image, the vertical at 500 millimeters. I noticed that the clouds were peaking just above the peak and the way the light was coming in a little bit from the side. So I zoomed in to isolate those details and make that image just about the Grand. This is one more image from the same location on the right. This is Mount Moran, and I was just completely drawn in by the way the light and shadow as the sun was going down created these layers and light play over on the hillside just below Mount Moran. Another little detail I noticed was that far off tiny tree that sat right where Mount Moran hits the hillside. So I zoomed in here to 240 millimeters so I could capture those details more closely and yet still include some of the beautiful sky. And you can see that little tree right there, which I just love. So using different focal lengths, lenses, I was able to capture a handful of different stories that were grabbing my eye in this grand scene. And this is the last scene. I just wanted to share a handful of unique images from the same morning, probably taken within 30 minutes of each other. I was at Schweckers Landing for sunrise. I shared this top right image last week, and we talked about wide angle. I loved the line of the river, the reflection of the mountains, and the grass in the foreground with the 24mm lens. And as I was walking along this path, I noticed the sunrise light was starting to come through the trees from the east, and noticed some rays popping through. And that's what this image on the left is. It's 105mm, zooming in close just to isolate those rays as they came through the trees. While I was noticing those rays, I also noticed these pockets of lupin, and the way the light was just lighting up certain little pockets of them. And this particular pocket was standing against some darker foliage beyond. So I used 360mm with my 150 to 600 to really isolate just the way that the lupin were being backlit by the sun, and it left dark shadow behind them. So 3 very different images in one location, just by taking the time to kind of notice what was around me and to choose a lens that would help tell my story. So I would definitely encourage you to really think about what your story is and how to tell that with the lenses and focal lengths that you have. How will you include what's important, and what do you want to exclude from your frame so that the main story, the main hero of your subject really comes through for you later and for your viewer as well. So as you go out to shoot, I encourage you to use a longer focal length to capture the distant or intimate scenes calling your eye. Use more than one focal length in the same location to capture 2 or more images that tell a different and unique story. I think it's really rewarding to go and to find small scenes within the grand landscape, capture the wider scene, but then also find some of those smaller scenes that maybe are just unique to you. The 3 lenses used, I have listed here again: the Sigma 14 f1.8, the Sigma 24 to 105 f4, and the Sigma 150 to 600 f5 to 6.3 contemporary. And then on the bottom, I was thinking after last week that I had an include where you might be able to find me, so I just added that. So you know where to find me after we're done with all of our webinar series. So thank you so much for joining me tonight.